All right, well, it's good to see everyone again. We are going to be talking today about the third book in my Meade and Lee series, or the penultimate book in the series, if you prefer. And this is Meade and Lee at Rappahannock Station, which covers the first offensive campaign waged by the Army of the Potomac since the Battle of Gettysburg. There had been a lot of to and fro in Virginia up to this point, but now Meade's army is actually going to stage a offensive movement against a fixed Confederate defensive position. And this is a story that is not well known. The fight at Rappahannock Station has garnered some attention in biographies and magazine articles and such, but the real story of the battle has never really been brought forward because it's never really been deeply researched. And that was one of the things I was able to do with this book. And so without further ado, let's talk about the Rappahannock Station Campaign. It was a relatively short campaign, only of 3 days duration from November 7th to 10th, 1863, but a very fascinating campaign nonetheless. So to reset ourselves in the particular moment in time, in early October of 1863, Robert E. Lee had launched an offensive against the Army of the Potomac, which at that point was located inside Culpeper County, what I like to call the Culpeper V, formed by the southeast running upper Rappahannock River, which forms the northern and eastern boundary of Culpeper County, and the east-west, more or less, east-west running Rapidan River, which forms the southern border of Culpeper County, so that it looks like Culpeper County is inside a giant V that's been laid on its side. And this terrain is problematic, as we'll discuss in just a little bit. And when Lee had come out from Orange Courthouse, he had managed to swing through Madison County and then outflank the Army of the Potomac. General Meade decided not to fight inside the Culpeper V. Instead, he retreated north along the Orange and Alexandria Railroad, the Confederates in pursuit. The Federals managed to get away for the most part on October 14th. However, there was a fight, a rearguard action at Bristow Station, where good Federal management and bad Confederate luck resulted in two of A.P. Hill's brigades being shot to pieces pretty badly. But this didn't stop the Federal retreat. The Yankees went ahead and pulled back to Centerville and behind Bull Run. Robert E. Lee could have outflanked them again, but he understood that that would merely drive them into the defenses of Washington, D.C. There was little point in doing that. And additionally, Lee could not linger close to the Potomac. With winter coming on, there was no way that Richmond would be able to supply his army that far north. And after 2 years of war, that region of the Old Dominion had been completely devastated, so that there were no foodstuffs for man or animal to be had there. So Lee decided his campaign had run its course. He withdrew down the Orange and Alexandria Railroad back toward the upper Rappahannock. And as he pulled back, he destroyed the railroad for a distance of about 20-25 miles. The Confederates pulled up all of the track. They pulled up all of the ties, piled the ties, set them on fire, laid the track on the burning cross ties until the track warped. And this is an actual picture of the devastation wrecked by the Confederates. They chopped down all the telegraph poles running alongside the Orange and Alexandria. They destroyed every bridge. They destroyed every culvert. And Lee did this knowing that Meade could not pursue very closely if he did not have a railroad supply line. And so the Federals couldn't operate very far beyond the southern operational point of the Orange and Alexandria Railroad. And that meant that it would be some weeks before Meade could draw close enough to the Army of Northern Virginia to try and launch a fall campaign. If the Confederates were lucky, and it turns out they weren't, the railroad repairs would take so long that the Federals would decide to go into winter quarters instead of undertaking a campaign. Yankee industrial might would enable them to repair the railroad within a very short period of time, certainly enough time to allow Meade to undertake an offensive. And so here's where we're at the end of October 1863, which is essentially where we had been at at the end of July 1863. And if we want to go further back, this is where the armies had been at the end of October and the beginning of November 1862, a year ago, with the Federals basically around Warrenton, stretched out between there and Warrenton Junction on the Orange and Alexandria Railroad, which of course is the Union Army's principal supply line. And the Confederate Army below the upper Rappahannock inside the Culpeper V. And the question is now, what's going to happen next? Railroad repairs have reached Warrenton Junction. This puts Meade within striking distance of the Confederate Army, and Meade has to decide how he's going to go about getting at Lee, and Lee has to decide how he is going to defend against a Federal thrust. And this was problematic for Lee for a couple of reasons. First off, he's outnumbered, but then he's always been outnumbered, so this is not exceptional. The real problem for Lee is that the Culpeper V, in which he currently has his army, is poor defensive terrain. It's a very beautiful part of Virginia, mostly open fields, rolling hills, occasional woodlands, but nowhere inside Culpeper County can you find terrain that would allow you to anchor both flanks of an army's battle line. That meant one flank would always be up in the air, no matter where you fought. Additionally, Culpeper is not very wide. Only 23 miles separates the O&A crossing at Rappahannock Station from the O&A crossing at Rapidan Station. And obviously that distance gets narrower as you head toward the apex of the V, so that any army fighting a battle inside the Culpeper V runs the risk of being beaten and forced very quickly to retreat over a river. Now, neither the Rapidan nor the Rappahannock is terribly wide. They are not especially deep, 4 feet, usually maybe 5 feet. But there are only a couple of bridges, and those are where the railroads cross these streams. There are plenty of fords, but those fords are natural funnels that would slow a retreating army down, allowing a pursuer to catch up with it. And additionally, if you get any kind of significant rain upstream, these rivers flood very quickly, which means that those fords could disappear. So choose to fight a battle inside the Culpeper V. You run the risk of a flank being turned. You run the risk of the enemy getting between you and the river to your rear. And even if that doesn't happen and you're forced to retreat, getting over that river before the enemy catches up with you and has a chance to maul you before you can escape is a very real possibility. And this is why Lee had decided not to defend the Culpeper V in August of 1863, instead withdrawing below the Rapidan. It is why Meade decided not to fight inside the Culpeper V in October, instead withdrawing above the upper Rappahannock and then retreating all the way to Centerville. And so as Lee retreats after the Battle of Bristow Station, he destroys the railroad and he brings his army to rest inside the Culpeper V, and he has to make a decision. Does he try to hold Culpeper County and maintain at least some of the ground that he has regained in his Bristow offensive, or does he do what he had done in August and withdraw below the Rapidan? And so these are the critical questions that Lee has to ask. And this means that he's only really got a couple of options. He could withdraw below the Rapidan. That is one option. He's exercised it once before. And there are advantages to being below the Rapidan. It puts the river between you and the enemy, forcing the Yankees to cross a body of water to get at you. In addition, the Confederates have fortified most of the fords along the Rapidan River, and so that would make the Federal job even harder. The other thing that's to your benefit if you're behind the Rapidan is that the south bank of the Rapidan is higher than the north bank. Perversely, this is also true about the upper Rappahannock, that the north bank of the river is higher than the south bank. And that means that Culpeper kind of sits inside of a bowl, if you will. And obviously having the high ground is military advantageous. And so for these reasons, it might make sense for Lee to withdraw behind the Rapidan. But there are problems with the Rapidan defense. And the principal one of these is that there are so many fords along the river that even if the Army of Northern Virginia spreads itself out between Liberty Mills and Morton's Ford, basing its operations on the railroad junction at Orange Courthouse, or rather the railroad depot at Orange Courthouse. The Army spread out for a distance of something like 20 miles, and that makes the left wing very far from the right wing, so that if the enemy were to cross to the east or to the west, he could have a chance of falling on one half of the rebel army before the other half could arrive to assist it. The other difficulty is that Lee cannot afford to spread his infantry out any further. So this means that the eastern fords of the Rapidan, Germanna Ford and Ely's Ford, then on to U.S. Ford, cannot be blocked. The Federals could come down across those river fords, and then they would be in a position to do one of two things. They could either turn west to try and strike the Army of Northern Virginia while it's still spread out, hoping to destroy one of its core before the other could come to its assistance. Or if the Federals wanted, they could march very rapidly to the southeast through the wilderness towards Spotsylvania County with the idea of getting between Lee and Richmond. And at that point, all that Lee could do would be to abandon the Rapidan line and try and race south fast enough to get between the Federals and the Confederate capital. The only way to really defend against either one of these Federal moves would be for the Army of Northern Virginia to be alert enough to catch the Yankees as they began to cross the Rapidan, and then to race eastward along the Orange Turnpike and the Orange Plank Road fast enough to intercept the Yankees before they could get too far south, if that was their intention, or to meet them head on if they were attempting to attack the rebel army and defeat it in detail. If this looks very familiar to you, it's because this is essentially what's going to happen in the Wilderness Campaign of May of 1864, and it's essentially what's going to happen in the Mine Run Campaign, which will begin at the end of November of 1863. For Lee, the real difficulty with defending the Rapidan was that it put him in a completely reactive state. He would be at the mercy of the Federals. He would have to ensure that he moved quick enough and got prompt enough warning of a Federal advance to successfully counter it. And Lee did not like surrendering the initiative to the enemy. So that suggested that he ought to try and hold on to Culpeper County. Now, if you're inside Culpeper County as a Confederate Army, you're in a good position if you want to launch an offensive campaign, because from Culpeper, you can march toward the Blue Ridge Mountains and the Loudoun and Shenandoah valleys, and those are the natural avenues of invasion to the north. Another advantage of being inside the Culpeper V is that if the Federals advanced to the west from Warrenton, swinging down into Madison County, ultimately with the goal probably of seizing Gordonsville, where the Orange and Alexandria Railroad made connection with the Virginia Central Railroad. The Virginia Central, of course, is very important because the agricultural bounty of the Shenandoah Valley travels on that line to the rail net that ultimately takes you to Richmond and Petersburg. So it's an important target that the Confederates would have to defend. But if the Federals try and make this move, the Army of Northern Virginia from inside Culpeper County would be in a good position to intercept them long before they got close to Gordonsville. And therefore, Lee believes that this is an unlikely Federal move. It would require Meade to let go of the railroad, rely on wagon trains for supply at a time of year when the weather could turn bad at almost any moment. It would also permit the Confederates to hit the Federals in the flank, or maybe cut off their retreat if they fought and lost a battle. And so although this is an option for Meade, Lee believes that by keeping his army inside the Culpeper V, he is well positioned to deal with it. The greater threat from the Federal position at Warrenton is that Meade would do in November of 1863 what General Ambrose Burnside had done in November of 1862. Right after he'd replaced George McClellan as commander of the Army of the Potomac, when the armies were similarly located, Burnside had taken advantage of the high ground along the upper Rappahannock that allowed him to shield the movements of his army from Confederate eyes. And by taking control of these river fords, he had enabled himself to make a rapid southeasterly march to Fredericksburg on the lower Rappahannock River. His goal, of course, was to seize the town and the high ground south of it. That would put him on Lee's strategic flank. The Confederates would have to abandon the upper Rappahannock and the Rapidan and race south to get between Burnside and the Army of Northern Virginia. And in fact, that is exactly what had happened. And it could have happened catastrophically if the pontoon bridges that Burnside needed to cross the lower Rappahannock at Fredericksburg had arrived on time as they were scheduled to. Of course, that didn't happen. The result was the federal debacle at Fredericksburg in December of 1862. But this move that Burnside had made in November of 1862 had been an extremely smart move that had posed a serious threat to the Confederacy. And it was only through really luck that the disaster that might have ensued had not occurred. And so Lee had to worry about this. And how does he defend against it? Well, he can't obviously undo topography, the fact that the high ground is on the north bank of the upper Rappahannock, and he is on the south side in the low ground, but he comes up with a pretty ingenious way to not only prevent Meade from replicating Burnside's 1862 maneuver, but also to force Meade into dividing his army, ushering half of it into a trap that would allow the Confederates to throw the bulk of their army onto a portion of Meade's army. In other words, Lee comes up with a way to stage an offensive defensive inside the Culpeper V. And he does that by establishing a bridgehead on the north bank of the river at Rappahannock Station, where the Orange and Alexandria formerly crossed the upper Rappahannock River. Now, that bridge had been burned during Meade's October retreat, and it hasn't been rebuilt. So the Confederates lay a pontoon bridge just upstream from the remains of the burnt railroad bridge. But from this fortified position north of the river, Lee gives himself the opportunity to move offensively against the Federals if they try to sidle to the southeast toward Fredericksburg, because he could explode out of that bridgehead in an offensive campaign that would allow him to threaten Washington, D.C., get between the federal armies and their capital, and therefore force the Army of the Potomac to come back and try and cut its way through the rebels in a position of their choosing to reestablish contact with the capital and get between the Confederates and Washington. And since that move would be incredibly dangerous to Meade, Lee believes that Meade will not make it. Instead, what he's going to have to do is to try and flatten the rebel bridgehead at Rappahannock Station, or deal with the Confederates inside the Culpeper V. And that would probably entail Meade dividing his army, sending half of it down to either attack or seal off the Confederate works at Rappahannock Station, while the other half of the Union Army crosses the Rappahannock at Kelly's Ford, where high ground in the north bank completely dominates the south bank, and the Federals would have no problem crossing. And the idea for Meade would be seal off Rappahannock Station, get the rest of the army over at Kelly's Ford, then move upstream to attack Rappahannock Station from the rear. This would be really the only option that Meade had. But if Lee could hold a good chunk of the Union Army at Rappahannock Station, keep it immobilized there because of his fortifications, then he would be in a position to send the bulk of the Army of Northern Virginia against whatever portion of the Army of the Potomac crossed at Kelly's Ford, attack it within a few miles of the river, and if it was defeated, push it back against the upper Rappahannock, where it would be unable to retreat effectively and thus might be destroyed. And so this is the option that Lee prefers. He's not going to pull back behind the Rapidan and assume the reactive stance. He's going to stay inside Culpeper County. He's going to build that bridgehead on the north bank of the river at Rappahannock Station. And that bridgehead is going to be the linchpin of his defense, because it should allow him to force Meade to divide his army and then let the Army of Northern Virginia attack the divided Union Army to advantage. And so this is the choice that Lee makes. Of course, on the other side of the battle line, we have George Meade. And George Meade, who's an incredibly competent commander, if a prudent one, who has a somewhat deliberate command style. Meade can look at a map just like Lee, and he sees the same options that Lee sees. So the Army of the Potomac could march through Madison County toward Gordonsville, but Meade sees the same problems with that route that Lee does. It exposes the Federal Army's communications. The Confederates can intercept the march before it even gets close to its target. This is really not a very practicable line of advance. What Meade would prefer to do is to abandon the Orange and Alexandria Railroad, which he's always thought has been a bad axis of advance with too many liabilities attached to it to make it worthwhile. Meade wants to do the thing that Burnside had done in 1862, this thing that Lee is most afraid of, and that is to make a rapid and hopefully secret move from the area of Warrenton down to Fredericksburg, get across the lower Rappahannock there and seize the high ground south of town before Lee could intervene. And he understands that he would have to do this better than Burnside did it. He would have to move quickly, he would have to move efficiently, and as I said, he would have to move clandestinely, but Meade believes that he can do it. If he doesn't take that move, the only other real option that he has would be to play the game that Meade wants him to play, and that is to send half of his army to deal with Rappahannock Station while the other half crosses the Rappahannock at Kelly's Ford in an attempt to attack Rappahannock Station from the rear. But of course, a divided army is an army that is vulnerable to counterattack, and with one half of that army on one side of the river and the other half on the other side of the river, the Confederates would be in the catbird seat. They would be in a position to throw their bulk against half of Meade's army, and those odds are not ones that Meade wishes the court. They could prove disastrous. So looking at these options, Meade decides on the Fredericksburg move, and he thinks that if he can make that move quickly enough, he puts Lee in the bad position instead of himself. The Confederates were probably going to have to race south to protect their capital before they would have the option to attack out of the Rappahannock Station bridgehead to threaten the federal capital. So there's a certain boldness here on Meade's part. It's kind of a daring proposal. So if you want to argue that he is a cautious general, this is sort of a counter to that. He's proposing seizing the initiative with a swift maneuver that would force Lee to play his game. And therefore, this is his plan. Now, he has actually proposed this before. He has, since the return of the Army to Central Virginia at the end of the Gettysburg Campaign, always wanted to abandon the O&A, shift the Army of the Potomac's supply base to Aquia Landing on the Potomac, and only 15 miles of railroad separate Aquia Landing from Fredericksburg. It would give the Union Army a much shorter line of supply, one that is much more easily guarded, one that Meade has to expend far fewer troops to protect. That would strengthen the Army of the Potomac's frontline combat power and enhance his ability to take the fight to Lee. He had made this proposal in August. He'd made it again in September. It has been twice rejected by Lincoln and Halleck, who see no reason for it. What they hear is echoes not only of Burnside, of George McClellan in this proposal, scheme to outmaneuver the rebel army instead of bring it to battle and fight it with the goal of its destruction. And the destruction of Lee's army is the only goal of the Army of the Potomac as far as Lincoln, Stanton, and Halleck are concerned. And they believe that shifting to Fredericksburg is merely shifting difficulties. Wherever Meade goes, he's going to find Lee in front of him. Wherever Meade goes, the Confederates are probably going to dig trenches. Destroying the Army of Northern Virginia will probably be no easier somewhere between Fredericksburg and Richmond than it will be somewhere between Warrenton and Gordonsville. So why make this time-consuming and expensive and difficult move? Meade should just go out and fight Lee where he is. When the Federals had been driven back on Washington by Lee's October offensive, Meade believed that his argument had been proven by events, and therefore in early November of 1863, Meade believes that if he makes the proposal to move on Fredericksburg for a third time, he will finally get permission to do so. But that is not what happens. He actually begins to lay the groundwork for the move. He's put his army in motion toward actually kicking off this rapid march toward Fredericksburg, and he sends really just an informative message to Halleck saying, this is what I've decided to do, and the only thing I need from you is notice that it is not approved if that were to be the case. And to Meade's shock, within 24 hours, he got that notice, and Halleck sends him a telegram that basically says, look, the president and I have twice rejected this plan. I don't know why you think a third attempt to get it approved would work any better. We're not going to allow you to do this. You can make whatever tactical movements you want, but a complete change of base is completely out of the question. And this mortifies and infuriates Meade, who is very frustrated with his superiors. They have a very dysfunctional relationship. They don't really get along with each other because they don't see eye to eye strategically. And for Meade, he is exasperated. When he's in the past asked for guidance and advice, he hasn't gotten anything that's been helpful. When he makes suggestions about what he thinks should be done, his professional advice is disregarded and his plans are disapproved. And he writes this very, very angry letter to his wife, Margaret, on November 3rd, after hearing from Halleck. These are his capitalizations there. My plan is disapproved. This is the best move that the Army can make. This is the one that is probably sure to succeed. I can do this. I can get away with this. I can seize the initiative. I can force Lee to abandon both the Rappahannock, the upper Rappahannock, and the Rappahannock River lines without a fight, gaining important ground without losing a single man. And yet my plan is disapproved. And having been disapproved, Meade knows that his only other option now is to play the game that Lee wants him to play, and that is to attack the Confederate defenses along the upper Rappahannock. That can only be done by trying to seal off Rappahannock Station while shoving the rest of the army across the river at Kelly's Ford and walking into a potential Confederate trap. Lee has planned it, Meade has seen it, and yet Meade's superiors are essentially going to force the Army of the Potomac into that very scenario that a movement on Fredericksburg would avoid. For a lot of generals, that probably would have been the end to any serious attempt at an offensive. A lot of generals would have just thrown up their hands and discussed at that point. They would have found reasons to procrastinate until bad weather set in and made a campaign impossible, or they would have gone forward with such animosity and lack of enthusiasm that they would have all but ensured that whatever move they made was going to be defeated. But George Meade is a much, much, much better man than that. And so being forced into an offensive option that he does not like, that he thinks is not particularly viable, he nonetheless is going to do his very best. He's going to give it his all. He's not going to half measure this thing. He is going to plan carefully, and he is going to go forward as vigorously as he possibly can. But it does mean that he's going to play Lee's game. And so just as Lee anticipated, just as Lee wanted, Meade divides his army into two wings. He gives the right wing to Major General John Sedgwick, who is usually in command of the 6th Corps. Sedgwick will have his own corps and the 5th Corps with about 26,000 men. His job will be to deal with Rappahannock Station. The other half of the Army of the Potomac, its left wing, will be under the command of Major General William F. French. Sedgwick and French are the ranking corps commanders in the Army of the Potomac. French will have his own 3rd Corps, as well as Gouverneur Warren's 2nd Corps and John Newton's 1st Corps, and about 29,000 men. The plan will be to make a rapid march on the morning of November 7th with the 6th and the 5th Corps coming down on Rappahannock Station, the 3rd and the 2nd Corps moving against Kelly's Ford, with the 1st Corps coming down to be in reserve. reserve close by Kelly's Ford, but available if it would be necessary to move to Rappahannock Station as well. Meade knows that the only real chance he has here to avoid playing exactly the game that Lee wants him to play is to attack successfully, not just at Kelly's Ford, where success is almost assured because of topography, but to also attack successfully at Rappahannock Station. If he could destroy the Confederate bridgehead at Rappahannock Station so that the right wing could cross the river at almost the same time that the left wing crosses the river at Kelly's Ford, then the Federal Army could unite quickly inside the Culpeper V. The danger of the Confederate Army throwing its bulk against one half of the Army of the Potomac would be removed, and then Meade could potentially assail Lee on poor ground inside the Culpeper V and do him real damage. So this is the federal plan, and on the morning of November 7, 1863 is put into motion, and the Federals do manage to achieve a measure of surprise here. Just a few days earlier, they had captured one of Lee's best scouts, and so the Confederates had no forewarning that the Federals were about to launch an offensive. And so the timing of this is going to take the Confederates by surprise, but the nature of it is not. On the evening before launching his offensive, Meade had written a letter to his wife, Margaret, to whom he is devoted. She is a very smart lady, a close confidant of the general. And this letter reveals Meade's mindset before he undertakes this campaign on which he is not keen. And he tells her that he's about to attempt to force the passage of the Rappahannock. And from previous experiences in such operations, he's not overly sanguine of success. He doesn't know if he's going to be able to pull this off. It's the only practicable move that he can make now that his preferred plan has been rejected. If this assault on the Upper Rappahannock fails, he will have done everything that he knows to do. If it doesn't work, then he doesn't know what he could possibly do next. And this has left him very, very anxious, so anxious that he's not written her routinely as he has always done in the past. He just doesn't even want to really be thinking and writing about things because the pressure is just so great. And Meade says, look, you know, I thought I knew what it would be like to command the Army of the Potomac, but the reality of that job has gone so far beyond his wildest expectations. It's so much worse, so much more difficult, so much more politically mired than he had imagined, that he regrets accepting the job, that he had not absolutely firmly said no when it was offered to him on the eve of Gettysburg. But having taken the job out of a sense of duty, he is going to do his duty. He is going to give it his all. He is going to do his very best, even if he knows that his best is unlikely to ever be enough for Lincoln and Halleck and Stuart. And if in the end he is relieved from command, he is willing to go from the post as cheerfully as he entered into it. So this is Meade's thinking on the eve of launching his offensive. He's not sure that this is going to work. He's going to do his very best, but it's not the plan that he wants to execute. It's the one that he's being forced to pursue, and fate will decide whether it will be the end of his tenure as commander of the Army of the Potomac or the road to a great success. So the first fighting on November 7th, 1863 is going to happen at Kellysville, which is adjacent to Kelly's Ford. This is a drawing done of it after the battle. Kellysville had been the primary manufacturing center in Culpeper County before the war. It had a clothing factory. It had a grist mill, which you see here. The clothing factory and its machinery had moved at the start of the war, but the grist mill is still there. But Kellysville is important because of the nearby ford. And that ford is defended by Ramseur's Brigade of Rhodes Division of Ewell's Corps of the Army of Northern Virginia. Because General Ramseur has gone home to get married, the brigade is currently under the command of Colonel William Cox, who usually is in charge of the 2nd North Carolina Infantry. That regiment is now under the tutelage of its second in command, Lieutenant Colonel William Stallings. And it has 7 companies of infantry, about 225 men actually stationed at Kelly's Ford. It has another 2 companies up north at Wheatley's Ford, and its 10th company at a ford a mile or so south of Kelly's Ford. The Confederates have fortifications at Kelly's Ford, but those fortifications are really only capable of dealing with a minor attack or harassment. And the reason for that is this high ground north of the river, technically here east of the river. And the Federals get artillery on this high ground. They're able to completely dominate the ford, the fortifications, Kellysville, and the 700 yards of sloping terrain between the river and a wooded ridge line behind which is the rest of Ramseur's camp, and beyond that, the rest of Rhodes' brigade. So the Confederate troops here are designed, if you will, as a tripwire. They are supposed to engage in a delaying action to force the Federals to deploy, to slow down their crossing of the river in order to give the Rhodes Division time to form up, to form line of battle, for Edward Johnson's division of Ewell's Corps to race over to Rhodes' assistance. The Confederates are expecting the Federals to attack here, and they have pre-plotted their response to it. And so delaying action here to give those 2 divisions time to form up, to block a very deep Federal advance into Culpeper County. And then Lee can look at what's going on at Rappahannock Station and decide what he is going to do next. If he's going to throw Hill's Corps over to the east to attack whatever Federals have advanced at Kelly's Ford, or if he's going to throw Hill's Corps out of the fortified bridgehead at Rappahannock Station to get between Washington and the Army of the Potomac. So this piece of the puzzle here is very, very important. And Stallings' 7 companies at Kelly's Ford are backed up by the 30th North Carolina under Lieutenant Colonel William Sillers, who has 500 men, and the Fluvanna Artillery under Captain John Massey, which, unlike most Confederate batteries, has 6 guns, not 4 6 12-pounder Napoleons. The fighting at Kelly's Ford goes pretty much in a predictable fashion. The 3rd Corps arrives unexpectedly. Its leading units go into line. The 1st and 2nd U.S. sharpshooters are the forward edge of the Federals. They advance on the ford. The Yankees move artillery up onto the high ground and begin to fire. And this is a sketch that was made at the time by Alfred Woad of Harper's Weekly. He's accompanying the 3rd Corps. And you can see here the advantage the Federals have. So once they get onto this high ground around Mount Holly Church, they can look down on Kellysville. There's your grist mill. The ford itself is kind of like right here. The Confederate trenches right there. You can see this long 700-yard sloping plain. Behind them, the Federal guns completely dominate all of that. And here's the ridge line, the wood ridge line behind which Ramseur's brigade is camped. So once the Federal guns are up here, this is a foregone conclusion. It's just a question of how long it's going to take before the Federals are across the river. The Confederate job, of course, is to make that take a couple of hours. And at first, Stallings' men do a pretty good job of that. Their fire from the entrenchments here stall the Federals and prevent them from crossing the river. At that point, the Fluvanna artillery comes out and occupies a pre-dug earthwork in an attempt to support the infantry at the ford. But very quickly, 3 Federal batteries turn against it and drive it off. The Massey can't keep his guns out here. His 6 smoothbores are facing 3 batteries of Federal rifled guns. It's not a fair fight, and the Confederate artillery has to abandon the field and withdraw. Colonel Sillers makes a gallant but ultimately foolish decision to try and advance across this 700 yards to reinforce Stallings at the ford. And so his 500 men in line of battle try to double click across this ground, which is not smooth. It's sort of broken up. There are fences and all sorts of obstacles in their way. The Union artillery takes them under fire as they make this dash. And so by the time they get into Kellysville, that regiment is completely demoralized and broken up. And Siller's attempts to rally it are to no avail. And so Stallings eventually tells him, "You're doing nothing for me here except increasing casualties. Get your men out and back into the woods." And Sellers agrees, and he orders his men back, and most of them will make the dash through the Federal artillery fire back to their starting point, but 180 of them decide they want nothing to do with running that risk, and they take shelter in the buildings of Kellysville and are basically out of the fight. Eventually, the Federals make the assault across the ford. This is done by the 1st U.S. sharpshooters under Lieutenant Colonel Casper Trepp. He sends 4 companies upstream to cross the river at a point which he hopes is slightly less defended and catch the Confederates by surprise. That doesn't quite work. There are Confederates there, but a relative handful. And so at the cost of only 10 casualties, those 4 companies managed to get across the river, and then they turn to strike the Confederate fortifications in the flank. And once that begins, then the other 6 companies of the 1st U.S. sharpshooters attack across the river. There is the assault going in as Alfred Wout drew it. The Federals get into the Confederate fortifications. There is a very brief but very nasty hand-to-hand fight in which Federal numbers prevail, and the fort is lost. The Confederate survivors retreat into Kellysville, and at that point, Colonel Stallings says, "We've done what we've been asked to do. We've done all that we can do here. The town doesn't matter if we've already lost the fort," and he orders a retreat. And so the Confederates abandon Kellysville. They run across that 700 yards of open ground back into the woods. At least most of them do. Roughly 130 members of the 38th North Carolina refuse to withdraw, and they are captured by the Federals when they move into Kellysville. So Kelly's Ford and Kellysville have fallen. It's cost the Confederates 45 dead, 78 wounded, 295 missing, most of whom are from the 30th North Carolina. And all the Federals have lost is 7 dead and 35 wounded. And French immediately has a division ford the river. He brings up his pontoon trains, and by nightfall, he will have 2 bridges down and 2 divisions over the river, with a 3rd ready to cross overnight. And so the first phase of Meade's offensive has been predictably successful, and it opens the door for the 2nd Corps to follow the 3rd Corps into the Culpeper Bee in the morning, and then the 1st Corps. What happens after that, though, is very much dependent on what's going on over at Rappahannock Station. So the entire forward defense of the Upper Rappahannock is under Ewell's tutelage, but the plan that is in place has been devised many weeks in advance. So while Ewell goes to make sure that Rhodes and Johnson's divisions are forming up, he orders his artillery up from the south. Confederate difficulties with supply have caused Ewell to put his artillery all the way toward the Rapidan at Cedar Mountain. Stuart's cavalry, for the most part, is around Culpeper Courthouse to facilitate foraging the animals and getting grain up to them from Richmond. And so the infantry defense here rests with Ewell's corps. And knowing that they expect the Federals to advance at Kellysville, Lee and Ewell have divided up responsibilities, with Ewell going to the east to deal with the situation there, while Lee will go to Rappahannock Station to monitor events. The other division in Ewell's corps, Early's division, which is camped along the railroad, is responsible for the defense of Rappahannock Station itself. Why does Rappahannock Station matter? Well, this is where a 500-foot long bridge belonging to the Orange and Alexandria Railroad had crossed the river. Before the war, this bridge has been destroyed and rebuilt several times. It's recently been wrecked by the Union Army as it retreated in mid-October, but obviously if Meade wants to push south into the Culpeper V and pursue Lee for very far, he would have to rebuild this bridge. But the other thing that makes Rappahannock Station important is the high ground just west of the bridge, which you can see right there. And this is where the Confederates have established their fortified bridgehead. The area is east of the railroad, relatively flat. So this is the bridge in 1862 before it was destroyed as part of the Second Manassas Campaign. So we're looking from the south bank of the river toward the north. This is the high ground on which the Confederate fortifications will be. And then east is a big, flat, open field, about 300 yards wide and almost a half a mile deep. This is Rappahannock Station itself. That, of course, has been burned by November of 1863. So remember what Meade is doing. He's bringing the 6th and the 5th Corps down on Rappahannock Station while French is forcing his way across the river at Kelly's Ford. And since Sedgwick is commanding the right wing of the Army, the 6th Corps will now be under the command of Major General Horatio Wright, who's a relative newcomer to the Army of the Potomac. He had taken control of the division in the 6th Corps. He had been at Gettysburg, but not had seen any of the fighting at Gettysburg. He has relatively limited combat experience, although he is a good officer. The 5th Corps is under Major General George Sykes, who had taken command of the 5th Corps at the end of June 1863, when its commander, George Meade, had been elevated to command the Army of the Potomac. Facing Sykes and Wright is a brigade of Confederates from Louisiana, better known as Louisiana Tigers. They are under the command of Brigadier General Harry Hayes, who is extremely competent, but Hayes is away on court-martial duty on November 7th, so his senior colonel, Davison Penn, who usually is in charge of the 7th Louisiana, has control of the brigade. But this is a difference without importance, because Penn is also an extremely talented, brave, and capable officer. He's got 5 regiments, the 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, and 9th Louisiana, and that gives him about 900 men. The Louisiana Tigers have only recently marched into the Rappahannock Station bridgehead. The way that Ewell had this worked out is that a brigade at a time would hold the fortifications. They would spend a week there before they were rotated out, and Johnston's division and Early's division shared the responsibility. And so every other week, one brigade from each of those divisions would have duty north of the Rappahannock River, inside and beyond the bridgehead. And in fact, just a day before, the famous Stonewall Brigade had marched out of the bridgehead and Louisiana Tigers had marched into it. They are deployed on the morning of November 7th in the standard fashion, which is to say that most of them are well outside of the fortifications. They're well to the north of the fortifications, with 7th and 8th Louisiana on a ridge about a quarter of a mile from the fortifications, and the 6th Louisiana on a wood ridge about a half a mile beyond the fortifications. And they're here for the purposes of observation, so that they can see any threat that's coming at them from the north. There's a scattering of Confederate cavalry vedettes here, but it's a very, very light screen. There's no major cavalry force in front of them, so the infantry is doing the job of observation. The 5th Louisiana Infantry is on the south bank of the river, manning earthworks to the east of the railroad, and that leaves only the 9th Louisiana Infantry and the 4 guns Louisiana Guard Artillery actually inside of the fortifications. So 900 Confederate troops. And a little before noon, they begin to see Federal units moving in the direction of Kelly's Ford. And Penn sends word of that back to Early, who dispatches the news to Lee and Ewell. Early orders up the only nearby reserves that are available for the bridgehead, and that is 2 Confederate batteries of artillery, who race up into pre-prepared positions on hills south of the bridgehead that overlook the pontoon bridge, which is the only connection between the north and the south bank. The rest of Early's division is ordered into the field, but since they are back toward Brandy Station, it's going to take several hours for them to reach the front. So there are only these 900 Confederates and this handful of batteries here. And at about noon, they see the leading edge of the 6th Corps appear west of the railroad, and the leading edge of the 5th Corps appear east of the railroad. And so altogether, 26,000 Federal troops begin to come at the Confederates who are on the north bank of the Rappahannock. And if Sedgwick had been aggressive at this point, and he had thrown even forward a couple of brigades or perhaps one division, the Confederates under Penn would have had no choice but to abandon the bridgehead. But fortunately for the rebels, Sedgwick is uncertain of the strength that he is facing. The orders that he's gotten from Meade are very descriptive about the Confederate fortifications at Rappahannock Station, the danger of the rebels launching a counteroffensive out of those fortifications. Meade has told Sedgwick that he is not certain that the rebel defenses can be successfully attacked. So Sedgwick's first responsibility is to seal off the bridgehead, to prevent the rebels from attacking out of it. And he is to attack the bridgehead as soon as he appears and drive the rebels over the river if practicable. And that phrase, if practicable, you hear all the time in Civil War orders. And it's a problematic one because it leaves an enormous amount of discretion to the commander on the spot. And Sedgwick is not going to run any risks. So the first thing that he does is to spend a couple of hours deploying his full strength. So between 12 and 3 o'clock in the afternoon, he gives over to shaking out 26,000 Federal infantry and their attendant batteries. And this is going to buy the Confederates some very badly needed time to sort of regain their balance. Penn wisely pulls his 3 outpost regiments back into the fortifications, leaving just a thin line of skirmishers to continue to observe the Yankee movements. The 5th Louisiana is brought across the river into the earthworks, and of course, Early has brought up Graham and Dance's battery. Early himself is riding up to the bridgehead to see what's going on, and so is Robert E. Lee. They're going to meet somewhere north of Brandy Station. They're going to ride up to the river together. They're going to spend the rest of the day over here on this hill where the reinforcing Confederate batteries are, only a few hundred yards from the front, so that they can gauge what's going on. And remember, for Lee, what's happening here is of vital importance. When he first gets here, he realizes that his plan so far is working exactly the way that he wants it to, that Meade has split the Army of the Potomac, that he sent a strong force to assail Kelly's Ford, that he obviously has a very strong force here in front of Rappahannock Station. And if this force can be held in place by bluff, if in no other fashion, then Lee will have created the possibility of massing most of his army inside the Culpeper V and using it to assail French's part of the Army of the Potomac at dawn on November 8th. If this status quo can be maintained overnight until the next morning, Lee is going to get to become the aggressor instead of defender. But a lot depends on what happens here, and Sedgwick has granted the Confederates the gift of time. He's given them 3 hours in which they are not going to be bothered by the Yankees much at all. The Federals will advance finally at 3 p.m., but they will not send forward their entire force. So what Sedgwick tells Wright and Sykes is that he wants a single division to advance on either side of the railroad. He wants a line of skirmishers sent forward east and west of the Orange and Alexandria. Those skirmishers' job is to seal off the bridgehead. These 2 divisions that are advancing behind them have 2 missions. The first of them is to support the skirmishers. And on the east side of the railroad, the advancing division under Brigadier General Bartlett, that's all they're supposed to do. It's going to move forward in a column of divisions. And this is a formation that the Federals are going to use throughout the battle. So it's very important for us to understand it. A column of divisions means that every regiment has a front of two companies, and those two companies, known as the division and regimental parlance, are stacked in one behind the other. So 10 companies to a regiment, 2 companies to a division, so you get 5 divisions. And this is the front, this is the movement here. And then you also have 2 regiments side by side. So in a brigade, 2 regiments is a division, and so stacked side by side. So everything's kind of doubled up here. And this is sort of a battering ram kind of formation, very imposing to see come at you. But on the east side of the railroad, all Bartlett is there to do is to support the skirmishers and make a show of force. And once the skirmishers get within a couple hundred yards of the Confederate fortifications and they reach the river to the east of the Confederate fortifications, Bartlett's division has done what it's supposed to do. It's supposed to veer off and take cover and await developments. On the west side of the railroad, Brigadier General Albion Howe's division is also supposed to support the skirmishers. But in addition to that, it is responsible for seizing the high ground upon which the 7th and the 8th Louisiana had been standing watch earlier in the day, taking that ground and securing it so that the Federals can put artillery there for the purpose of trying to shell the Confederates out of their fortifications. And so this is a very cautious move on Sedgwick's part. Again, if he had sent these 2 divisions forward and told them to keep going to attack the Confederate fortifications, they would have easily overrun the rebel earthworks, accomplishing what Meade wants, opening the door to getting the right wing across the upper Rappahannock at Rappahannock Station, and enabling the 2 wings of the Union Army to unite south of the river quickly, which of course is what Meade needs more than anything else. But Sedgwick is careful. Again, remember, he doesn't know what's in front of him. He's not going to have any chances. So when the Federals advance at 3 p.m., this is what it looks like. Here is Howe's division going forward. These are the Federal skirmishers, these thin blue lines. The Confederate skirmishers fire and pull back, dueling with the Federal skirmishers who advance. Bartlett's division comes forward, but once the skirmishers reach the points designated for him, 2 of his brigades swing into cover on this wooded ridge line to the east. The other goes into cover up against the railroad embankment along which the Orange and Alexandria ran. Remember, the railroad has been destroyed here, but that embankment is still visible. And so it is a handy dividing line between the 5th Corps and the 6th Corps. So Howe's division comes up and seizes that ridge, but that's as far as it goes. 5th Vermont swings down, grabs Beverly Ford, and then begins to come along the river toward the Confederate fortifications. And there's a real opportunity here, because if Howe and Bartlett had kept going, 900 Confederates are not going to stop 2 Federal divisions. The bridgehead would be abandoned without a fight. But even without that, Howe recognizes that the rebels here are weak, and indeed they're very weak. So Penn, who's only got these 900 men, he can't even adequately man his entire line of trenches. So he's got the 9th Louisiana over here. I'm sorry, he's got the 5th and 7th Louisiana over here guarding his flank. And then he's got the 8th and 9th Louisiana over here guarding this flank. But the only thing in between them is a thin line of skirmishers. The 6th Louisiana is in a little outer work on the east side of the railroad. So this is not a solid Confederate front. If the Federals had pushed against it, it would have been overwhelmed. And Howe senses that, and he goes to Wright and he begs for permission to attack the Confederate fortifications, and Wright refuses it because Wright can see rebel entrenchments to the west on high ground, and he's afraid that there's Confederate artillery there, and if the Federals attempt an attack, this artillery will blast them to pieces. And so he says, no, that's too dangerous. This is not what Sedgwick has ordered. So we're gonna seal off the bridgehead with our skirmishers. We're gonna bring up the artillery. We're gonna try and shell the Confederates out of the position. Of course, there was no Confederate artillery in these fortifications. The threat that Wright was not willing to encounter does not exist. But once again, the Federals have missed an opportunity here They had a chance early in the morning to overwhelm the fortifications without a fight. Now they had a second chance to overwhelm the fortifications without a fight, and both times they have let that opportunity slip out of their grasp. So for the Federals, what are they looking at? What do the fortifications at Rappahannock Station present to them as a threat? Well, there had been fighting here before during the Second Manassas Campaign in August of 1862. And this is a drawing that Edward Forbes made of the ridge on which the Confederate fortifications will be placed in November of 1863. And he draws this basically from the ridge where Sedgwick artillery is going to go into position, the ridge formerly held by the 7th and the 8th Louisiana. So this is the ridge that the Federal guns are going to be on. This is the ridge where the Confederate fortifications are located. These houses, all of these buildings are burned by this point. They don't exist. That number 4 there's the Rappahannock River. Right here is where the railroad bridge, or what the stone pillars that mark the former location of the burnt railroad bridge would be. Here are the hills on the south bank where the Confederate artillery, which has come up to reinforce, are located. This is where Lee and Early are going to watch the battle. This hill actually curves back toward the river, which you can see here. This is where the railroad would be, right there. So this is all the field of the 6th Corps, and the 5th Corps is over here. And then what you see right here is the Freeman's Ford Road, which actually runs east to Freeman's Ford, and then west to Freeman's Ford, and then east all the way over to Kelly's Ford. This is a sunken part of the road right here. And so it's sort of like a natural trench. The Confederate fortifications up here, so there's one small fort holding 2 guns on this end of the line, and then there's a larger fort kind of here in the middle, but this is a gradual slope. It's 200 yards from the sunken portion of the Freeman's Ford Road to the crest. It's not a long distance. It's not a difficult slope to climb, and although there is a natural drainage ditch that sort of slices down through here, there are no Confederate abatis, there are no Confederate defensive ditches or anything like that at all. So this is what the battlefield appears like from the Federal side. Let's talk about the Confederate fortifications. One of the interesting things that I discovered when I was researching this battle is that there was no official map made of the fight by an officer on either side. And I suppose that's because the Mine Run campaign follows so closely on this offensive. But the official records contain no map. The official atlas contains no map. There are lots of verbal descriptions of the ground, the fortifications. Lots of soldiers who take part in this fight wrote about that, but no maps. Fortunately, no official maps doesn't mean no maps at all. And in my research, I discovered 2 that were drawn by participants in the action. One of those participants was east of the railroad, one was west of the railroad. They are not professional cartographers. None of them have any scale on them at all. They differ in some slight respects, but they do allow us a visual representation of the battle. So let's start with this map over here, whose author is unknown. So here's the line of the railroad right here. There's the burnt railroad bridge. Here are those 2 hills on the south bank where the Confederate artillery is. And you can see here a small little stream called Tin Pot Run. It's no obstacle to speak of, but it runs along the north edge of the ridge that Sedgwick is going to put his artillery on, where the 7th and the 8th Louisiana used to be, and it's going to go under the railroad where there used to be a trestle, and then it's going to curve around and enter the Rappahannock River to the east of the burnt bridge. You see the pontoon bridge that is the connection between North and South Bank for the Confederates. Here's the ridge line on which the Confederate fortifications are built. You'll see that it parallels the river, which makes a sharp bend on the western end of the Confederate fortifications. Here is the small fort on the high hill right next to the railroad, in which the Confederates have 2 guns. Then there's 300 yards of trench. and then a large fort where the Confederates have 2 guns, and then the fortifications bend back toward the river. And this map is important because it shows us that on the east side of the railroad, you have a detached outwork. This is where the 6th Louisiana is. It's about 160 yards long, and it bends back toward the river, sort of following the course of Tin Pot Run right there. And this is that large wooded hill mass where Bartlett's division swung around to take cover after the skirmishers had gotten into their position. Here's the Freeman's Ford Road right there that we're talking about. And this conforms pretty nicely with the other map. This one is actually drawn by the surgeon of the 50th New York Engineers, who made a habit of sketching his regiment's battlefield. So this is drawn from the perspective west of the railroad. So it doesn't have the outer Confederate work here, but it does have the South Bank trenches that had been occupied by the 5th Louisiana earlier in the day. There are the 2 Confederate hills where the reinforcing artillery has taken place. Here's the railroad embankment. There's the burnt bridge. There's Tin Pot Run right there. This is the ridge where the Federal artillery is going into battery. But notice the important details here of the Confederate defenses. So here's the Freeman's Ford Road right there. Here's the small fort with 2 guns immediately overlooking the railroad. Then 300 yards of trench to a large fort. And then some very important details. Right here is the pontoon bridge. But you'll notice that that pontoon bridge has roads leading to and from it. And this is very important because the whole point of a bridgehead, or a tête de pont, as the French terminology would call it, and that's the terminology that Lee uses when he writes about it, is to allow you to attack out of it. And that means that you would have to pass infantry through your fortifications, artillery and wagons and ambulances through your fortifications, and that means you would have to use a road. And obviously, if you dig a solid wall of entrenchments, you cannot drive vehicles over that. And so the Confederates do not block these roads. And so if you watch very carefully here, you'll see that as the road comes up this steep slope from the river, it passes through the fortifications in 2 places. And the Confederates have left gaps in those fortifications to allow the passage of those roads. And so this is the weakest part of the Confederate line. It's not a solid line of earthworks here. There are gaps in them. And to defend those gaps, the Confederates have built 2 outer works that actually are there to block those roads. And those outer works are relatively short. And the idea is that they're guarding these gaps. If you've ever had to drive onto a secure installation and zigzag through barriers to get in there, then you know exactly what's going on here. And so this is a very vulnerable spot in the Confederate line. From there, the Confederate fortifications stretch back toward the curve in the river, but they are not, as they are often depicted on maps showing the fortifications, they're not this smooth semicircle that runs back to the river. No military man would build a line of fortifications that made that kind of a bulge because that diffuses his fire. And so the Confederates don't do that. They're professionals. This is a zigzag line of trenches that allow crossfire against attackers coming into it. And in places, this Confederate defensive position is rather sophisticated because the 300 yards of trench between the 2 forts, the small and the large fort, the Confederate line, is actually a stepped trench. If you're familiar with World War I, this is going to look very familiar to you. So instead of a long line that is dug in the earth so that if the enemy gets in one end of it, he can shoot all the way down the other, you have these traverses that keep the enemy from shooting down the length of the trench. And so you have the parapet that's dug, the earth thrown up in front of the trench, and then you have traverses that where you throw the dirt up where you're digging perpendicular so that also provides cover so that the enemy cannot shoot from here to here. These walls of dirt are protection. So this is what the Confederate defensive position looks like. And from the perspective of the Federals, especially from John Sedgwick, this is a formidable looking kind of position, not one that he is eager to throw an infantry assault at. And it's a position that's about to get stronger because remember, Early has ordered his division up to the front, and the first of his divisions that reached the field is Hoke's North Carolina Brigade. This had been Avery's brigade at Gettysburg. It is now under the command, however, of Colonel Archibald Godwin, because Hoke, who replaced Avery after he was shot at Gettysburg, has gone back to North Carolina with his 21st Regiment to round up deserters. So Hoke's brigade today is under the command of a Virginian, Colonel Archibald Godwin, and he has only 3 regiments, the 57th, 6th, and 54th North Carolina. Notice how big the 54th North Carolina is. That's because it missed the Battle of Gettysburg. It was instead guarding the prisoners that the Confederates had taken at Winchester as they advanced toward Maryland, Pennsylvania in June of 1863. And that's important because it means that the 54th North Carolina doesn't have the experience that the 6th and 57th North Carolina has, and an experience that for that matter, that the entire Louisiana Tiger Brigade has. Those regiments in the Louisiana Tigers, the 6th and 57th North Carolina, had made the dusk assault on Cemetery Hill at Gettysburg on the evening of July 2nd, 1863, that took that ground briefly and almost won the battle for the Confederates. They were not reinforced. The Federals were able to drive them back. But if there are any units in the Confederate Army that are familiar with the dangers of a night assault, the opportunities that are presented by a night assault, it is the defenders of the Confederate bridgehead. That is all of them except the 54th North Carolina, which had not taken part in that evening assault in July of 1863. When Hoke shows up, Early orders him to cross the pontoon bridge and reinforce the Confederate defenders north of the Rappahannock. At about the same time that Hoke's men arrive on the battlefield, General Harry Hayes returns, having abandoned his court-martial duty, and he rides into the bridgehead to resume command of Louisiana Tigers from Colonel Penn. And so once Hoke's men are in under Godwin's command, this is what the Confederate defense looks like. 7th and 5th Louisiana holding the western flank of the bridgehead, 54th, 6th, and 57th North Carolina holding the center, the 8th Louisiana defending this weak point where the road breaks up the entrenches and the large redoubt, which has 2 guns, the 9th Louisiana holding the 300 yards of stepped trench between the large redoubt and the small fort, which is so small it has no infantry in it. It just has these 2 field pieces. And then the 6th Louisiana that is here east of the railroad on a detached work and has no communication whatsoever with the rest of the defending Confederate force. Other brigades from Early's division are going to show up. One of them, Gordon's, is sent here to watch over Norman's Ford. Pegram's is held in reserve. Posey's division from Anderson's, Posey's brigade, rather, from Anderson's division comes up and takes position in some fortifications watching Beverly Ford. But this is the Confederate position now. And for the Federals, the arrival of these Confederate reinforcements was a threatening sign. And remember, Sedgwick is as worried about a potential Confederate attack out of the bridgehead as he is about trying to flatten the bridgehead. So as Hoke's men begin to enter the fortifications, he moves the rest of the 6th Corps up into line beside Howe's division, which has been here for a little while. And of course, this is going to put these federal troops in a position from which they could potentially launch an attack against the Confederate bridgehead. But an infantry attack is not something that Sedgwick is anxious to make. It's certainly not something that Wright or Sykes are anxious to make. So instead, between 3 and 5 o'clock, they are going to rely on their artillery. So eventually 3 batteries on this ridge over here, 2 batteries on this ridge over here, dueling with the Confederate guns inside the bridgehead, the Confederate battery south of it. It's loud, it's noisy, it inflicts very few casualties, and does nothing to force the Confederates to give up their position north of the Rappahannock. And so if this is what Sedgwick is relying on, it fails. If this is how he interprets attack immediately, as are his orders from Meade, it's ineffective. So this federal bombardment is not making the Confederates budge. And here we are at 5 o'clock. It's almost dark, and everything is working out exactly as Robert E. Lee wants it to work out. He's got half the Union Army stymied in front of 2 brigades holding a fortified bridgehead on the north bank of the river. French, meanwhile, has got 2 divisions across at Kelly's Ford. He's preparing to pass a 3rd division over the river. Rhodes and Johnson are in a blocking position in front of French's troops, and A.P. Hill is prepared to move in whatever direction that Lee wants him to go. That's probably going to be to go east so that he can launch a massive attack against French in the morning, trying to crush one half of the Army of the Potomac, while the other half is 6 miles away on the opposite side of a river in front of Rappahannock Station. And if Sedgwick, Wright, and Sykes had been left to their own devices, this is where things would have ended on the night of November 7th, and Lee would have had his big chance to launch that devastating attack the next morning. Unfortunately for the Confederates, Brigadier General David Russell has other thoughts. Russell has stepped up to command the 1st Division of the 6th Corps because Wright has stepped up to command the 6th Corps while Sedgwick is commanding a wing. Russell and Howe, by the way, are very important fellows because they had been given the job of attacking Marie's Heights at Fredericksburg during the Chancellorsville campaign. Remember, Sedgwick had been given the job of keeping the Confederates pinned down at Fredericksburg while Hooker took the rest of the Army across the river further to the west. And the great moment for Sedgwick in that campaign had been the successful attack on the Confederate fortifications south of Fredericksburg at Marie's Heights, fortifications that had defied the entire Army of the Potomac in December of 1862, were successfully taken by an attack of Russell and Howe. So if there are any men in the Army of the Potomac who do not have an instinctive fear of fortifications, it's Russell and Howe. And Howe's already made the case that he should be allowed to attack the Confederate bridgehead at Rappahannock Station and had been denied. But Russell's going to have a different experience. So Russell is a guy who likes to ride forward and reconnoiter from the front. And he's got 2 regiments or skirmishers from 2 regiments of his brigade on the skirmish line. 121st New York has 50 men under the command of Captain John Fish. And then he's got 5 companies, the 6th Maine, which is under the command of Colonel Benjamin Harris. And along with skirmishers from Upton's brigade and Howe's division, and then the 5th Corps, they've been sniping with the Confederates inside the bridgehead for several hours, in addition to all of this artillery fire that's been going back and forth. Russell's been out here on the skirmish line, and as the setting of the sun nears, he perceives that the rebel line is lightly held. He believes, in fact, that it's only occupied by a strong skirmish line. Now, it's not quite that weak, but to be sure, the Confederates are standing in a single rank inside this fortification. So Russell perceives an opportunity here, and he sends word back to General Wright proposing a dusk assault. And what Russell's idea is to lead that assault by sending the other half of the 6th Maine as skirmishers over this ridge, across this nearly quarter mile of open ground into the sunken portion of the Freeman Ford Road, where the other half of the 6th Maine has been skirmishing for most of the afternoon. He knows that the Confederates will see this, but he believes that they will disregard it because coming just before nightfall, they'll think that this is just the relief of one skirmish line by another, which is something that you would do at that time of day. But indeed, What Russell intends is that when the two halves of the 6th Maine merge here, they will fix bayonets, uncap their muskets to remove the temptation to stop and shoot, and then they will launch an immediate bayonet attack out of this sunken road across this drainage ditch toward the large fort. And the idea is that they will get up here and keep the Confederates in this fort busy long enough for the 5th Wisconsin, which will come forward in a column of divisions 5 minutes behind the 6th Maine, to arrive and reinforce that fight. And then 5 minutes behind them will come the 119th Pennsylvania and the 49th Pennsylvania, also in a column of divisions, to come forward and then exploit the breakthrough, take the pontoon bridge, and cut the Confederate defenders off from retreat or reinforcement. These columns of divisions will concentrate Federal strength on a very narrow front and give them an overwhelming numerical advantage at the point of attack, and this should prove to be decisive. The fact that you are going to attack at dusk means that the Confederates will not be able to see well, and therefore they will not be able to realize how small this attacking force, only about 1,200 men, is, and they will not be able to effectively counter it as a result. Also, with Federal artillery here firing on the rebels and fire artillery here firing on the rebels, you kind of create a dead zone through which this Federal infantry can advance without having to worry about being hit by its own artillery fire. And also, because you're doing this at dusk, the Confederate guns south of the river cannot fire on these Federals directly. Their own fortifications in the way. They could throw direct unaimed fire out here, but not direct aim fire, which would be more dangerous. And so this is Russell's plan, and he sends that back to Wright. And Wright at first is inclined to disapprove it as something that, as he says, would be hopeless. But then he stops and he thinks about it for a moment. Given the time of day that this attack would go in at dusk, the Confederate artillery fire would be ineffective, that the falling darkness would help shield the Federal advance, Wright thinks this actually might have a chance of working. And so he gives Russell permission to make the attack. The key regiments here are going to be Colonel Benjamin Harris's 6th Maine, which is going to be the leading edge with its doubled skirmish line, 320 men. And then the second wave of the attack, which is going to be the weight that's going to help push this thing through to victory, the 5th Wisconsin, 300 men under Colonel Thomas Allen. Fortunately for the Federals, the attack does not take place exactly the way that they intended it. And this proves critical to its success. Russell, if this attack had gone forward the way that he planned it, would have been defeated, because there would have been enough Confederates available to counterattack to drive the 6th Maine and the 5th Wisconsin back. But fortunately for the Federals, the skirmishers to the left and the right of the 6th Maine, although they have no official part in this attack and have no orders to take part in it whatsoever, are going to go forward as well. And this is going to keep a large part of the Confederate defenders tied down, keeping them from concentrating against the 6th Maine and then the 5th Wisconsin. So to the right of the 6th Maine is the 121st New York, 50 men under Captain John Fish. And the only orders that Fish had received from his brigade commander, Colonel Emory Upton, when his skirmishers went forward, was that he was to stay up with the farthest advance. And so when the 6th Maine goes forward, Fish believes that that means he's supposed to go forward, because that's the farthest edge now, and his 50 men are going to attack. And it just so happens that they're going to strike the weakest part of the Confederate line, where it's going to be easiest to break. To the left of the 6th Maine, you're also going to get the help of the 5th Corps skirmishers. Now, there are 75 members of the 20th Maine who've gone forward on the skirmish line earlier in the day. And although the 5th Corps was supposed to be on the east side of the railroad, because the ONA makes this little jog just before it gets to the river, 50 of the 20th Maine skirmishers, under the command of William Morrell, are on the west side of the railroad. And Morrell has wandered over to talk to some hometown friends of the 6th Maine. After all, these are two Maine regiments. And he's over here when Harris brings forward the second half of the 6th Maine skirmish line has his men fix bayonets, uncap their muskets, and as he's explaining what's about to happen, Morrell hears it. And one of the 6 Maine officers, see Morrell, says, hey, you want to go in with us? And Morrell, knowing that, hey, these are guys from Maine, we can't let them do this by our own, he says, you bet I want to. And so he runs over to his troops and he says, boys, the 6th Maine is going in, let's go in with them. And so when the 6th Maine starts forward, 121st New York attacks the weakest part of the Confederate line. The 20th Maine attacks the stepped trench between the two forts. And this triggers the advance of the other 5th Corps skirmishers east of the railroad, because there's still some 20 guys from the 20th Maine who are over on the east side. They've got somebody up here on the embankment, who's looking to keep the two halves of the regiment working together. And when they see this portion of Morrell's troops go forward, they believe that orders have been issued that they hadn't gotten. They're supposed to attack. So the 20 men from the 20th Maine east of the railroad go forward. And that makes the skirmishers of the 83rd Pennsylvania, 44th New York, and 16th Michigan believe that there have been orders issued that they didn't get, that they're supposed to attack as well. And so they go forward as well. And so this not only greatly strengthens the Federal attack in terms of numbers, it broadens it at the same time. And this is going to be crucial to the Federal success, because notice that the 5th Wisconsin is behind. It is not 5 minutes behind the 6th Maine's attack as it was supposed to be. It's 10 minutes behind, because when it began to advance over the ridge, separating it from the rebels, it was going forward with unloaded muskets as per Russell's design. The soldiers in the 5th Maine were not keen on going forward with unloaded muskets, and they were grumbling and complaining. And although their officers said, no, you're going to rely on the bayonet, they said, no, we're not. And they began to individually load their weapons. Colonel Allen hears all of this, turns around and says, what's going on? And once he realizes how his men feel about this, he orders them to stop and load. And this is going to eat up time. So it's going to be twice as long before the 5th Wisconsin gets to the front as had been anticipated. It's going to make the participation of all these other skirmishers even more important than it otherwise would have been. So the Battle of Rappahannock Station is now engaged, and there are 2 parts of it. There's the part east of the railroad embankment, and there's the part west of the railroad embankment. Edwin Forbes is on the scene. He draws this fight from a position east of the O&A. And this is what's happening on that side. So here's the railroad embankment. You can see how tall it is. It's about 8, 9, maybe 10 feet tall. There are the stone pylons of the burnt railroad bridge. There's the river. There's the high ground south of the Rappahannock where the Confederate artillery is. There's the small fort right there. And then we go down, we can see the stepped trench leading to the large Confederate fort. And this is the outwork held by the 6th Louisiana. So you can see it connects to the railroad embankment, and then it runs down and it curves back toward the river just in front of Tin Pot Run, which is right here. And here are the 5th Corps skirmishers advancing against the rebels. Inside of these works are only about 180 men of the 6th Louisiana under Colonel Monaghan, and he sees these Federal skirmishers coming at him. They outnumber him, and he also knows that earlier in the day, there had been a whole Federal division that had been advancing in support of these skirmishers. And in the darkness, he can't see much beyond the Federal skirmish line, but he quite understandably believes that the skirmishers would not be coming forward on their own. There has to be a lot of Federal troops behind them, which they are screening. And so knowing that his isolated 180 men are not going to stop this massive Yankee advance, he orders his troops to move by their left flank and then retreat along the embankment and ford the river in one of the only places that's fordable in this stretch, even though it's armpit deep here, and that's where the former bridge used to span the stream. About half of the 6th Louisiana manages to get over the river. Before the Federal skirmishers get up on the riverbank, they start shooting into the backs of the Confederates who are still trying to wade the river. And as the Yankees pause to reload, they begin to yell at the Confederates to turn around, to come back, to surrender. And about 75 or 80 of the rebels turn around and start to slosh back toward the Yankees. And at that point, one of their officers steps out from behind the stone bridge abutments and orders his men, no, turn around, head toward the south bank and escape, at which point the Federals begin to shoot at them again, forcing the Confederates to take cover behind the bridge abutments. And from that position, they are ultimately convinced to surrender. So about half of the 6th Louisiana is lost here at the very beginning of the fight, and the entire far right flank of the Confederate line is collapsed. These Union skirmishers over here, by the way, have also managed to knock out one of the Confederate guns in the small fort with their sharpshooters, so that there's only one gun here still in operation. West of the river, this is what it looks like. So here's the small fort. There's the 300 yards of stepped trench. There's the big redoubt. And what you see here, this is the 20th Maine skirmishers attacking the stepped trench. Here is the 6th Maine coming up onto the big trench. Now, when the 6th Maine came forward, it didn't surprise the Confederates. Remember, the rebel defenders were familiar with the possibilities of a night attack from the Battle of Gettysburg. So they were ready and waiting. They pumped 3 volleys into the 6th Maine, shot down probably about a third of its men. Most of the rest go to ground in front of the Confederate fortifications. Many of them yell out that they surrender. Some of them, however, decide to go on into the rebel works, get in briefly, are pushed back. The 6th Maine then surges forward again with more men, gets more men inside the work, but they're pushed back and they're fighting on the parapet, looking backward, wondering where the 5th Maine was because it's late. The 5th Maine, however, does finally get up, and you can see the 5th Maine here. And as the 5th Maine comes forward to reinforce the battle, the tide is going to turn. So you can see the Federal skirmishers here have already taken the right flank. The 20th Maine, now reinforced by half of the Wisconsin, is going to see the small fort and the stepped trench, forcing the 9th Louisiana back. The 6th Maine, reinforced by one of the battalions of the 5th Wisconsin, is in a vicious hand-to-hand fight for the small fort. And Captain Fish's skirmishers, who managed to hit this weak part of the line, had the great good fortune of capturing 127 rebels. So the Confederate parapets are not very high. They're easily mounted. The Confederate trenches are very narrow, so that a man in the trench cannot shoot directly at the man in front of him if he's standing on the parapet, because he would have to point his musket almost straight up in the air. And in the darkness, all these Confederate defenders believe that there have to be a lot more Yankees attacking them than what they can see. And this is where these dense formations help the Federals a lot. So coming out of the darkness, these dense formations seem to the Confederates like they must be merely the leading edge of a vast Yankee horde that's being thrown at them. They remember that earlier in the day, they had watched 2 entire Federal corps go into line. And so there are plenty of Yankees out there in front of them. There are only about 2,100 rebel defenders, 26,000 potential Yankee attackers. And in the darkness, the Confederates cannot tell that they're being assailed by such a relatively small force. So when Fish's men got up on these outer parapets where the Confederate line was broken up by the road, they started yelling that the rebels should surrender. And 127 Confederates here had given up to 50 Yankees, and this had breached the Union line. Now, the 57th North Carolina and then the 6th North Carolina are going to refuse the flank and fire at Fish's men and drive them back toward the 6th Maine. But you've already lost 127 men here, and that means that Harry Hayes is going to have no luck trying to get together enough men to counterattack all the Federals that are now swarming into the large redoubt. And when the 119th and 49th Pennsylvania come up, that's going to prove too much, and it's going to push the Confederates out of this entire half of the line. In some instances, the hand-to-hand combat here is incredibly vicious and brutal, but Federal numbers are going to prevail, and the rebels are going to be driven back toward their pontoon bridge. And so the 8th and 9th Louisiana, completely disorganized in the darkness, are a mob back here by the bridge. The 6th and 57th North Carolina have refused the flank, meaning the 54th North Carolina has to spread itself out even more thinly to try and make up for their comrades withdrawing from the trenches. 3 Federal soldiers from the 6th Maine run down toward this disorganized mob of rebels and fire their muskets in the air and demand a surrender. And again, the Confederates have no idea how many Federals are coming at them. They assume that it's going to be wave after wave after wave. In the darkness and the confusion and the disorganization, these rebels have no desire to be shot down defenseless as they are now. And another 180 rebels surrender to these 3 men from the 6th Maine. And so this weakens the Confederates under Hayes even more. And they're now not capable of making any effective resistance whatsoever. Russell, who has been wounded in the foot, has belatedly realized that there were far more Confederates in his fortifications than he had expected. And he sent a courier back to Colonel Emory Upton, commanding the other brigade in his division, and ordered him to send forward 2 regiments to reinforce the fight for the large redoubt. Interesting that Russell, who's commanding an entire division, has attacked initially with only a single brigade, and that now when he needs reinforcements, instead of bringing up a full brigade, he brings up simply 2 regiments. So Russell is certainly doing this on the cheap. And if it had not been for the unexpected and unordered assistance of all those other skirmishers to his left and his right, his attack would have already failed. But because they had participated, because his decision to strike at dusk has enhanced the psychological effect that had been imprinted on Confederate minds by Sedgwick's deployment of 2 full corps earlier in the day, this is going to prove to be enough strength. So Upton comes forward, personally leading the 5th Maine and 121st New York. By the time that they near the battlefield, the fight for the big redoubt is over. Russell rides back, intercepts Upton, and says, now what I need you to do is to silence the Confederate fire that is coming from this salient and enfilading our troops in the large redoubt. So Upton swings around, deploys his men into line in the drainage ditch, and then orders an attack against this salient. Fortunately for the Federals, as they come forward, the Confederate defenders who open fire on them shoot too high. Only about 10 or so of Upton's men are hit, and then the Federals are up in the trench. And after a very short hand-to-hand fight, they destroy half the 54th North Carolina and even take its flag. And at this point, Upton realizes that the Confederates to his right are very badly disorganized. And without waiting orders for Russell, he decides that he's going to exploit his success. So Alfred Woad draws a picture of all of this. He, of course, is not here. He's at Kelly's Ford. So his depiction of the actual combat is not realistic at all, but he does give us a lot of details of the battlefield. So here's the pontoon bridge right there. There's the burned remnants of the railroad bridge. There's the Rappahannock, which at this juncture is very wide and very deep. It's not fordable. Of course, it's November, so the water is deadly cold. Here's the steepness of the slope leading down to the river. There's the small fort, the 300 yards of trench, the large fort, which the Federals have already captured. And then notice the zigzag nature of the Confederate defensive line, which jives with the maps that we were looking at earlier. So Upton, having captured this portion of the trench, now does something very, very innovative. He sends 1 battalion of the 121st down to take control of the pontoon bridge. He leaves 1 battalion of the 5th Maine to hold the trenches that he's already taken. And then he's taking the other battalions of those 2 regiments, and he takes them out of the trench, back down the slope in front of the Confederate line. Here he reorganizes them, orders them to right face, and then has them double quick in front of the Confederate works, but downslope in the darkness where the Confederates cannot see them well and certainly cannot shoot at them effectively. And once the rear of his column comes adjacent with Confederates, he orders his men to move by the left flank, instantly throwing them into line of battle. And then just before he orders a charge, he shouts out loud enough for the Confederates to hear, "Men of the 5th Maine, 121st New York, when the enemy opens fire, you are to lay down because there are 4 other lines of battle behind us that will charge over us to seize the rebel works." Now, this is a lie. There's nobody behind these 2 Federal battalions. But Upton hoped that this would be disconcerting to rebel ears, and it was. Remember, the 54th North Carolina is the one regiment in the rebel position that was not part of that night attack on Cemetery Hill at Gettysburg. So they are particularly vulnerable to the psychological impact of a dusk assault. And so when the 5th Maine and 121st New York charge, they meet virtually no resistance. The 54th North Carolina falls apart completely, with most of its men surrendering. And so as Upton gathers up his prisoners here, he's basically shot his bolt. He doesn't have enough strength to do anything else. And there's still 2 Confederate regiments to his right. The 7th and 5th Louisiana have been shooting at these Federal skirmishers on the western flank. And there are 2 Confederate regiments, the 6th and 57th North Carolina, who had refused the flank, who are now kind of isolated back against the river. If they could counterattack, they might redeem the situation. But unfortunately, in the darkness, they can't tell really what's going on. And in addition, there's a very stiff wind blowing up from the south. So they haven't been able to hear any of the yelling or shooting that's gone on over here. In fact, Lee and Early, who've been watching all this from the South Bank hilltop, don't even realize what's happening. They think they've just seen some skirmish shooting. And in fact, Lee leaves to head back to his headquarters, believing that with nightfall, the fighting has basically stopped and the situation is well in hand. Well, certainly that is not the case. And it's going to get worse, because Colonel Clark Edwards, the commander of the 5th Maine, after the 54th North Carolina collapses, sees some of its fugitives running off to the west. Not wanting them to go away, he takes a dozen men and chases after them. But within a relatively short distance, to his surprise, he suddenly finds himself standing behind the 5th Louisiana's battle line. In fact, he's almost amongst its file closers. So he's gotten himself into a very sticky spot. The Confederates recognize him. He and his men are at best captured, at worst they're dead. And so Edwards decides to bluff, and he yells out very loudly, "Who's in command of this part of the line?" And Captain John Angell, who's in charge of the 125 men in the 5th Louisiana, hears that and he says, "I am. Who wants to know?" And Edwards says, "I do." And he explains who he is, and he orders Angell to surrender immediately. And Angell, who had no idea there were Federals inside the fortifications, is stunned. He doesn't know what to do. And Edwards says, "Surrender immediately or I will attack." And Angell says, "Well, give me some time to consult my officers." And Edwards says, "I'm not going to give you a minute. Surrender immediately." And then he throws his arm back over behind him at the mob of Confederate prisoners who are being ushered out of the works by the 121st New York and 5th Maine. And Edwards lies and says, "You see all those men back there? Those are my men. And if you don't surrender, I'm going to attack immediately." And Angell still declines. And so Edwards plays his last card and yells, "5th Maine, 121st New York, charge." And at that point, Angell, who knows that his men are pointing in the wrong direction, and would be attacked in the back, decides to go ahead and give up. And when he surrenders, the 7th Louisiana has no choice but to surrender as well. And this leaves only the 6th and 57th North Carolina under Godwin's personal command. The leader of the 6th North Carolina, Colonel Samuel Tate, urges Godwin to fight his way to the bridge and try to escape. But Godwin says, "I have no orders to abandon the fortified bridgehead, and I'll continue to fight," which is a gallant but foolish decision, because eventually the Federals come down and they force all these Confederates to surrender. So some rebels manage to escape across the bridge, especially mounted officers and couriers. A few men successfully swim the river. Other men try it, and because of the cold water, they don't make it. They drown. But within about 45 minutes of the start of the battle, the entire Confederate position is gone. 1,600 prisoners, 7 colors, and 4 guns captured by the Federals. Unfortunately, this has all come too late for Meade. It's not till 10 o'clock at night that he knows that the bridgehead has been flattened, and that Sedgwick, despite that success, has not gotten across the river. So the chance of a Confederate counterattack on French at daylight without a united Army of the Potomac is very, very real. So Sedgwick is told to send the entire 5th Corps over to reinforce Kelly's Ford. along with some parts of the 6th Corps, to prepare against a Confederate counterattack in the morning. That counterattack, of course, is not going to happen. With Rappahannock Station's fortifications gone, Lee has the entire plan of defense he put together destroyed. So he spends until midnight giving his quartermasters time to pack their wagons and their supplies and begin a retreat toward the Rapidan River. At midnight, he pulls his infantry back to the only decent position where he can make a stand, which is just 2 miles north of Culpeper Courthouse. His right flank anchored on Pony Mountain, but his left flank completely up in the air. This is an incredibly weak position. If the Federals attack him, they could turn one or both of his flanks, and the Rapidan River is just a few miles to the south, and he might not be able to successfully retreat across it. But Lee has no choice. He's got to stand here for an entire day to give his wagon trains time to get back over the river. He deploys Stuart's cavalry to slow a Federal advance, Fitz Lee's division along the O&A, Hampton's division here around Stevensburg on the road that leads to Kelly's Ford, Lane's infantry brigade going out toward Rixieville to guard against any Federal advance from that direction. Meade is slow to realize that he's gained the initiative, and he spends the first half of November 8th uniting his army, getting most of it over the river at Kelly's Ford, then sending the 3rd Corps up to help the 6th Corps get over Rappahannock Station in case there were still Confederates on the south bank facing it, which of course they're not. The Federals do not move toward Brandy Station until almost noon, and although they drive off Fitz Lee's cavalry, Meade is surprised not to find Confederate infantry here. This is where he thought Lee would make his stand. And when Lee's not there, Meade believes the stories being told to him by Confederate prisoners that the entire Army of Northern Virginia has retreated across the Rapidan overnight. Meade has no real reason to believe that from a pragmatic standpoint, but for some reason he chooses to accept those stories. And so with the exception of Lane's brigade giving Buford's division a bloody nose as it attempted to come down the Rixieville Road toward Culpeper Courthouse, the Federals make no contact to speak of with the Confederates on November 8th between the skirmishing around Brandy Station with Fitz Lee's men and some light skirmishing between Hampton and Davies' brigade at Kilpatrick's division. At 3 p.m., Meade allows his army to go into camp, even though the Confederates are only 3 miles away. And if he kept advancing, he would have found them before dark and at least been able to potentially start a battle that would force Lee to remain in place or put the Army of the Potomac in a position that if the Confederates retreated overnight, they would not be able to get across the river before the Federals could catch up to them. But Meade, having not been sure he could get across the Rappahannock and having succeeded in doing something that he wasn't positive he could do, had played for limited stakes and decides to collect his winnings and walk away from the table. And so the great potential here of forcing the rebels into battle on some of the worst ground that they'd ever held is missed. And that means that Lee is able to retreat unmolested across the river overnight. And by the dawn of November 9th, the armies are back where they were at the start of the Bristow Station Campaign for all intents and purposes, with the Confederates holding the fortifications on the south bank of the Rapidan River and the Federals up here toward the northern end of the Culpeper V. And this is a great success for Meade. President Lincoln was pleasantly surprised by it and telegraphed a hearty "well done," which Meade is very proud of. And the cost of all of this, well, for the Confederates, the cost is 1,939 missing, 1,600 of whom are from Hoke's and Hayes brigades, 181 wounded, 21 dead. And the Federals suffered only 96 dead, 409 wounded, and 11 missing. So a very lopsided casualty figure, essentially 2 Confederate brigades, all but destroyed, in one of the great tactical victories in the history of the Army of the Potomac, but a victory that ultimately accomplishes nothing more than pushing the Confederates a few dozen miles south behind the Rapidan River and into a strong position that Meade will now be expected to assail before winter shuts down campaigning for the rest of 1863.